Hey everyone, welcome back to the China History Podcast. Laszlo Montgomery here once more with Feeling. And today, to kick things off in 2024, going to be the Year of the Dragon, starting on February 10th. We're going to try and finish up this briefest of series. We've traced the long and winding road of the China history timeline and the history of Chinese medicine, and all the great physicians and the works that are ascribed to them, in some cases whether they wrote them or not. Chinese medicine is called the oldest continually practiced form of medicine in human history, still going strong in our day. And as we've seen so far from the past 4 episodes, as we got closer to our trying times, Chinese physicians of yore, through the acquisition of knowledge both inside and outside of China, of new techniques and treatments, and from observations and empirical research, continuously fine-tune their treatments, remedies, and drug prescriptions. But before I continue on, rather than announce this at the end, let me mention here at the outset, February 1st, 2024, I'll be in London, appearing as part of the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and gala events marking the opening of an exhibition at the London Science Museum. Direct from the Hall of Clocks at the world-famous Palace Museum in Beijing will be a curated collection of mechanical chime clocks. I cordially invite you to come see and experience 自鸣钟凝视矩阵, clockwork treasures from China's Forbidden City. And it all starts on February 1st at the London Science Museum. I'll be in town for a whole week, and I'm sure looking forward to meeting some of you. Anyone counting on hanging up their shingle at the local strip mall somewhere and getting into the TCM business from listening to this series? Sorry to disappoint. The minutiae of theory and all the interrelationships between all the unseen and mysterious forces working inside and outside your body, it's not an easy subject to communicate. But by now you're familiar that these forces existed, and in all the great works I've mentioned, yin and yang, the 5 elements, your qi, your jing, and all the other forces affecting human health were all interrelated. And the key to understanding Chinese medicine was in understanding all the particulars of these forces and how they impacted your health. That was one thing that hadn't changed much since the times of Bian Che. So in this series, I've leaned more in the direction of introducing the milestone big picture advances, physicians, texts, and in general, how things progressed along the timeline of Chinese medical history. We saw last episode how during the Song, the government stepped in and intervened in regulating public health, the medical profession, and medical literature. The first government-run public clinics started showing up early in the northern Song, and all of the most celebrated works of the greatest physicians going back to the beginning were updated, commented on, and edited for those sophisticated 11th century times. Let me quickly interject one small thing. When I'm presenting all this information concerning all these advances and some semblance of public health care, this was something that was limited to the cities, and the bigger cities at that. The countryside and way out west, well, they still relied on the same old traditional folk remedies passed down to them by their ancestors. And official government-sanctioned, standardized versions of these classic medical texts were published, and Bi Sheng's movable type printing and all the technological improvements that soon followed allowed this knowledge of medicine to be much more widely disseminated than in past centuries. And many among the Confucian scholarly crowd began to more and more gravitate to this now quite respectable profession. And this explosion of printed books spawned an entire book-selling industry that in turn led to an even wider dissemination of knowledge that, due to limitations in printing, had traditionally stayed within a very tight bandwidth of scholars, officials, and elites of society. Okay, last time we looked at the advances made during the Song, Jin, and Yuan. This time, we're going to focus on the last 2 dynasties in China's imperial history, the Ming and the Qing. 544 years in all between the two, 1368 to 1912. It was during the Ming Dynasty in the late 16th century that the Jesuits first started showing up in China. Now, you recall their history in China. St. Francis Xavier arrived in the general vicinity first, but only made it as far as Shangchuan Island off the coast of Guangdong, not far from Taishan, dying there in 1552. 1557, China leased Macau to the Portuguese. 1579, Michel Ruggieri arrived in China, followed by Matteo Ricci in 1582. And they were the first Westerners, other than perhaps Marco Polo, who got a close-up look at Chinese medicine and who first got to peruse the great medical texts, including, of course, the two holiest of holies, the Shennong Materia Medica and the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. French Jesuit Nicolas Trigault arrived in China later in 1611. Inspired by Ricci, he also studied the Materia Medicas. Trigault studied the most basic fundamentals of Chinese medicine, including pulsology and how the whole body was wired together. And after decades of scholarship, the first translation of a Materia Medica into Latin was completed in 1656. This was 12 years into the Qing. The Jesuits were the first Europeans to propaganda at the ancient Chinese medical texts, and this allowed them to be the first ones to interpret Chinese medical practices to the European nations, at least as far as they understood it. Ricci was quite close to one of the more celebrated physicians of the Ming, and this was Wang Kentang. He lived 1549 to 1613, so Ricci got to meet and know Wang Kentang during this man's prime. Wang came from one of those distinguished scholar official families. His bio states he scored at the top of the civil service exam and worked high up in the imperial bureaucracy. He wasn't an Yiguan, or imperial physician official. He was just a high-up court official who also studied medicine and became quite famous for successful treatment regimens performed on patients when others had failed. He wrote and compiled two massive medical works in particular, which were among the most important and widely read texts during the Ming and well into the Qing. First, there was the Standards of Diagnosis and Treatment of the 6 Branches of Medicine, the 六科兼治准绳. This was published in 1602, a year after Matteo Ricci's dream came true and he was finally invited by the Wanli Emperor to come to Beijing. This work by Wang Kentang was spread out among 44 volumes and contained 4.5 million characters. The 六科, or 6 branches of medicine covered in the text, included formulas, cold-induced diseases, sores and wounds, pediatrics, gynecology and obstetrics, and there was a 6th category for miscellaneous diseases. And like so many of these Song and Ming-era great works, it took everything that was known and accepted since ancient times, as well as all that had been discovered and learned since, and brought everything up to date. And like with so many medical scholars going back to the Han, using all his accumulated wisdom as one of the most celebrated physicians of his day, Wang Kentang also added his own personal clinical experiences to this work. Wang Kentang was one of the many officials who got to meet Matteo Ricci. During his years in China, Matteo Ricci met almost 150 people of note, including Wang Kentang, who were included in his book published in 1615 on the Christian expedition among the Chinese undertaken by the Society of Jesus. Wang had arranged to dispatch one of his pupils to go study math under Ricci. Ricci had written about Wang Kentang, quote, "This third pupil had been sent by his master, meaning Wang Kentang, who was a distinguished philosopher of the faculty of the Royal College of Peking, called Hanlin. This faculty is composed of the most brilliant of the highly educated of the realm, and it is considered to be a singular honor to be chosen for it." End quote. He was talking about the Hanlin Academy, of course, established by Tang Emperor Xuanzong in the early 8th century and lasting until the end of days for the Qing in 1911. Wang Kentang's other great text was called the Complete Book of Orthodox, Ancient, and Modern Medical Works, the Gu Jin Yi Tong Zheng Mai Quan Shu. And with an ambitious and promising title like that, you know it was one massive work. It contained 100 volumes of wisdom culled from 44 of the most renowned physicians in Chinese history, most of them named over the course of these past 5 episodes. And with Big Pharma still hundreds of years in the future, as people of the world began to mix amongst each other, one of the many things of shared interest was, of course, medicines. A lot of treatments were freely passed back and forth along the Silk Road and maritime Silk Road routes, and not all of this exchange of knowledge of pharmaceutics and treatments were good. The Jesuits were very keen to learn about Chinese medicinal recipes, and as I said, they studied whatever Buncao or Materia Medica they could get access to and translated one of them. Prior to the Columbian Exchange, in the first half of the 15th century, the Yongle Emperor sent Admiral Zheng He on voyages to the west, to all the major known ports of trade from Vietnam to the east coast of Africa and today's countries of Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, and the Comoros. Among all the luxuries laden on board Zheng He's fabled treasure ships were Chinese doctors who treated both the officers and crew of the fleet, as well as patients they saw at all the ports of the vassal states they called at. It's an early version of Médecins Sans Frontières. Sometime during the 16th or 17th century, syphilis was introduced to China. It showed up first at the port city of Guangzhou. No hard evidence who was responsible, but this dread disease was one of the unwanted consequences of the Columbian Exchange. When discussing this disease, that goes by several colorful and pejorative names, in the context of Chinese medicine, it was a physician named Chen Sicheng who became one of the first in China to devote his energies to understanding and combating syphilis. In 1632, he wrote a monograph on the subject of syphilis called Secret Writings on Putrid Ulcers, Mei Chuang Mi Lu. How Chen Sicheng came to write this book can be traced back to the illustrious family dynasty of physicians he came from. When he was studying in Hangzhou, he acquired certain teachings from his Chen family physician ancestors concerning the treatment of certain STDs, among them syphilis. And he used this secret family knowledge to occasionally treat his fellow students and friends. Among the treatments used to treat syphilis back in the Ming was a chemical called corrosive sublimate. It's also known as mercury bichloride. And if that sounds a little toxic, this chemical's main use today is as a catalyst to convert acetylene into vinyl chloride, which is used in the production of PVC. Well, back in the day, in Europe and in China and Japan, they'd use this substance to treat syphilis. And Chen Sicheng's improvement on this old formula was to add arsenic to the compound. And this new Chen Sicheng formula, called Sheng Sheng Ru, though it proved to be more effective than the previous drug in killing the Treponema pallidum bacterium, it was one of those kind of things, well, if the patient didn't die of mercury poisoning, they may have wished they had. The Tang Dynasty had Sun Simiao. The Song Dynasty had Song Ci, Qian Yi, Wang Weiyi, Su Song, and there were also the 4 great physicians of the Jin and Yuan. The Ming Dynasty didn't disappoint either, and I suppose their shining star among a constellation of noteworthy physicians was Li Shizhen. He's among the best known of all the great Chinese physicians, going back to Bianque, Hua Tuo, and Zhang Zhongqing. Once again, Li Shizhen came from another one of those renowned physician families that went back several generations. So he was kind of destined for this profession. His father had big plans for him and was determined that he find a respectable position as an yiguan, or physician official, earning his pain quotidien in the Ming Emperor's employ. As I indicated last episode, you had to pass a rigorous exam that not only included the great medical classics, you also had to know your 5 classics and 4 books as well. I won't burden you with the details, but Li Shizhen was not destined for this celebrated career in medical officialdom. After repeated failures on the exams, he had to consider other options. He pursued his own interests in the Buncaos, or materia medicas, of his age, the Zhenglei Buncao in particular, mentioned in the last episode. This was the collected classified materia medica compiled by Tang Shanwei, and his exhaustive study of this and other materia medicas and encyclopedias helped Li Shizhen to produce this magnum opus and one of the all-time most important texts in Chinese medicine, the Buncao Gang Mu, the Compendium of Materia Medica, or the Great Pharmacopoeia, among other appellations in English. He began writing the Buncao Gang Mu in 1552 and finished it 26 years later in 1578, the good years of the Wanli Emperor's reign, when he had Zhang Juzheng in his corner, assisting him in managing palace and national affairs. And despite his past academic failures, Li Shizhen made it all the way to the Taiyuan, the Imperial Academy of Medicine, and there he rubbed elbows with all the most celebrated physicians of his day. But Li Shizhen found things a little bit too stuffy for him there, and as his bio tells it, he tired of the place, only lasting for about a year. So when the age-old tradition that went back to the times of Confucius and Mengzi, he wandered the land, traveling to 6 provinces, gathering and exchanging information. And wherever he went, he mixed with other like-minded people of science, exchanging medical knowledge and everything about plants, herbs, and roots and their specific uses as medicines. He conducted experiments on animals and humans to judge the effectiveness of all these herbs, extracts, and other concoctions. And he would validate or disqualify anything previously written before in the Materia Medicas of centuries gone by. The Buncao Gang Mu was published in 1596, 3 years after Li Shizhen's death. It was a 53-volume work. There was so much new and additional content added to the Buncao Gang Mu. Li Shizhen used an entirely new classification system to organize all the herbal and other medicines. The way the Buncao Gang Mu was put together, with its categories and subcategories, it made things a lot easier to find what one was looking for. And with all the advances in human knowledge and understanding of the natural world, it was only logical that Li Shizhen would also make corrections to previous works. And believe me, it's been 4¼ centuries since the Buncao Gang Mu was published, and there's plenty of inaccuracies in there. So much of what we know about and take for granted was completely unknown in Li Shizhen's time. So while these works, like the Buncao Gang Mu, were celebrated milestones in their day, this compendium of materia medica reflects only what was known and understood in 16th century China. Previous to Li Shizhen's Buncao Gang Mu, the earlier physicians like Cao Yuanfang first categorized diseases by their symptoms. Later works organized diseases by their origin or suspected causes. And while these methods were an improvement over earlier medical texts, it still wasn't optimal. This was due in part because, back then, so little was known about etiology, the study of the causes of diseases. Li Shizhen classified his Buncao Gang Mu according to the genus of the substance and whether it was a root or an herb or some kind of extract. Paul Unshold called this work, quote, a qualitative climax in the development of the materia medica literature, expanding the genre from a work on drugs to a comprehensive and detailed encyclopedia of medicine, pharmaceutics, mineralogy, metallurgy, botany, and zoology, end quote. In all, there were 1,892 different plant-based drugs listed, 20% of which were new. There were also 444 extractions from animals listed. 374 of the new drugs introduced came directly from Li Shizhen, a man who many call the greatest or one of the greatest herbalists in the history of Chinese medicine. In toto, the Buncao Gang Mu contained 11,096 prescriptions spread out amongst the 52 volumes. In addition to the Buncao Gang Mu, He wrote around 17 other medical texts across a number of branches of medicine, but nothing compared to this great pharmacopoeia. And despite the praise given to the subsequent Materia Medicas going back to the Han Dynasty, this one by Li Shizhen was the greatest of them all. His 3 extant works have been called among the most important medical texts and systematized and organized everything that was known about medicine in China. Gang means outline or guiding principle, and mu means an item or something that is subordinate in an outline, like a table of contents. So this Bancao Gangmu was the most up-to-date, organized, and accurate Bancao, or Materia Medica, ever produced in all the years of Imperial China. And 4.5 centuries later, it's still around and used. Not long after publication, the Bancao Gangmu made its way to Japan, where it was very well received. One of his other significant works was one on pulsology that divided everything into a total of 27 pulses. And these 27 are still in use today by TCM pulsologists. And back in those Ming Dynasty days, there was as much medical quackery as there had ever been. Li Shizhen didn't mince words when it came to all the Ming-era versions of snake oil salesmen who went around selling worthless potions and cure-alls, or even worse, herbal remedies that guaranteed longevity. Li Shizhen and others in the Ming as well were united in speaking out against all the mysticism, superstition, and nonsense that had permeated the medical profession. And if you took in that 2-parter on the history of Chinese alchemy, you may recall that it was Li Shizhen who authoritatively and finally came out in his Bancao Gangmu and announced to the people of China that consuming all these Waidan alchemical elixirs containing mercury and other toxic substances was hazardous to your health, and in fact, killed you. He said this following the death of the elixir-loving Jiajing Emperor in 1567. And as far as his medical ethics went, he was aligned with Sun Simiao, someone held up as practically a saint. So Li Shizhen is someone who's rather highly regarded in the history of Chinese medicine, and I dare say in Chinese history and culture as well. Yang Qizhou, 1522 to 1620, was another failed and frustrated would-be government official who turned to medicine. And what Li Shizhen did for herbal medicine in the Ming, that's what Yang Qizhou did for acupuncture. The time had come again, and someone had to take on the task of going back for centuries and dredging up all that had ever been written on the subject of acupuncture, going back to Huang Fu Mi in the Western Jin and his canon of acupuncture and moxibustion, the Zhenzhou Jia Yi Jing. And taking stock of the latest understanding of acupuncture, he culled these past books of outdated material. And he wrote a number of commentaries on the old books and of prescriptions across all fields of medicine. And from all his research, Yang Qizhou produced his own great work on the subject, the Zhenjiu Da Cheng, the great success of acupuncture and moxibustion. And the Zhenjiu Da Cheng became another essential desk reference for any physician all the way through the Qing dynasty. The matter of referring to records of case histories went back to the time of Chun Yu Yi in the 2nd century BC. Others followed his method, and these case histories continued to be published. But no system had ever been established to organize all this information, and the bibliography of past case history texts remained fragmented. In the Ming Dynasty, the importance of these detailed case histories rose in importance and became a prominent genre of medical text writing. And then in the 1500s, a number of Ming physicians began to organize and sort through all these past case histories, and like the search engines of today, they sought to create ways to easily locate information. A standard procedure was devised that allowed for easy sorting of medical case histories. Let me also mention Wang Ji, 1463 to 1539, another renowned physician of the Ming. If I told you we came from a long line of physicians going way back, would you believe me? The official histories have nothing but praise for Wang Ji. He was another Sun Simiao in that His selfless devotion to his patients is part of his bio in the official histories. He wrote several books, but it was his Shishan Yi An, or Stone Mountain Medical Cases, that he's most remembered. This was a collection of over 100 case histories centered where he was based in the city of Qimen in Anhui Province, famous for their excellent Qimen tea, one of my faves, and for serving as the headquarters of Zheng Guofan's Hunan army during the Taiping Rebellion. He was already well known and respected in his time for his work on acupuncture and syphilis treatment, and these exhaustive case histories, 114 of them, were all compiled by his disciples after his death. Wang Ji's Shishan Yi An presented the patient's symptoms from onset of illness through to recovery. For medical historians, these documented case histories provide a valuable window into the state of early 16th century Chinese clinical medicine and which texts and treatments they relied on most. The Siku Quanshu, or Complete Library of the Four Treasures, included this work among the 36,000 volumes contained in this reservoir of all the great and near-great works from a wide range of topics, including medicine. Yeah, the Qianlong Emperor. Size sure mattered to him. Jiang Guan, 1503-1565, was a contemporary of Wang Ji. He was a physician from Anhui who wrote both his own case studies and compiled a book summarizing the extant case history books going back to before the Tang. He carried out a comparative analysis between knowledge of pharmacology in his day and compared his findings to previous data. This case book, compiled by Jiang Guan, was called the Mingyi Lei An, Famous Medical Cases. There were a total of 12 volumes that discussed 205 types of illness, all explained in the context of case studies involving diseases. In this book, the Mingyi Lei An, it was just one of so many great medical texts of the Ming that sought to review all the past history of various aspects of Chinese medicine and bring all of that into the modern age in their time. This was one of the hallmarks of the Ming, even more so than in the Song. So much of what was new and innovative in the Song was reinterpreted in the Ming. The four great physicians of the Qin and Yuan dynasties, who we looked at last time, had established contending schools of thought in their theoretical works on the causes of diseases and how to treat them. And these different theories had some fundamental differences, and they all didn't read from the same hymnal. Into the Ming, there continued a vigorous debate about which of these schools of thought was the correct one. A school called the Zhezhong Pai, or eclectic school, sort of combined aspects of all four theories. But most practicing physicians in Ming China went with the theories presented by these physicians from the preceding dynasty. And the crux of the debate concerned the contention between the warming yang versus the nourishing yin schools. Yin and yang. Yin represents the cooling, nourishing, and moistening aspects of your body. To nourish yin is all about supporting and replenishing these qualities. A deficiency of yin has symptoms of dryness, fever, exhaustion, and other manifestations of too much heat in your body. This deficiency would be treated with yin-nourishing herbal remedies and certain lifestyle changes that together would cool the body and restore moisture and balance. The last of the four great physicians of the Qin and Yuan, Zhu Zhenheng, said that yang is always in excess in our bodies, no matter what. And if there was too much yang, it meant yin is deficient. And among the forces that promote warming yang are one's emotions. So is overindulgence and some of the fun things in life. So Zhu Zhenheng believed you had to nourish or build up your yin in order to counteract the excessive yang that is always prevalent in your body. Zhang Jiabin, also known as Zhang Jingyue, in 1624, did a reworking of the Su Wen of the Yellow Emperor's inner classic. and his makeover of the Huangdi Neijing included all his commentaries of this book that by this time was already more than 1,000 years old. He served in a number of military advisory positions and had also studied to become a physician, and Zhang Jiebin was famous for interlacing his medical writings with all this military jargon. He went against the established theories of the day and advocated for evidence-based analysis over theory, and used some rather unorthodox treatments that in many cases worked better than previously long-accepted ones. His major work was the Jingyue Quanshu. This goes by the name Complete Compendium of Zhang Jingyue. Like everything in the Ming, he was part of the whole debate that went back to the four great physicians of the Qin and Yuan. Was it an excess of yang that was the underlying cause of illness, or was it too much yin? Zhang Jiebin focused his theories on spleen and stomach function as the key factors involving the root causes of imbalances in one's body. And to keep the body in balance, Zhang Jiebin parted ways with the nourishing yin school and called for the yang, warming aspect to be nourished instead. And something interesting about part of the treatment to warm the body was the promotion of smoking tobacco. Though recommended, not in excess, smoking tobacco was one way to nourish the warming yang component. Another Ming Dynasty luminary in the field of medicine was Li Zhongzi. He lived right in the middle of that time of great scholarship in the Ming Dynasty, 1588 to 1655, the agonizing decades of the Taichang, Tianqi, and Chongzhen emperors. The eunuch Wei Zhongxian directing that tragedy till 1627. Li Zhongzi wasn't a highfalutin official in the imperial government. He didn't belong to any of the myriad of schools or medical pai or factions. He was a non-sectarian. I didn't mention this, but going back to part 1 of this series, one of the many strands that tied the past and the present history of Chinese medicine were the dangers and viciousness of this profession. Professional jealousies at the imperial court, all the different factions who had diametrically opposite opinions about the fundamental workings of the body and interpretations of the classic medical texts. In the Ming Dynasty, it was no less contentious. But Li Zhongzi remained a band apart, as far as he was concerned. As a physician, he used whatever treatments worked, and he didn't write any of these gigantic compendia summarizing all the medical knowledge going back to BC times. He wrote these concise, easy-to-read books on medical theory that became, in their day, the closest thing resembling medical textbooks. Li Zhongzi's great work was a 1642 work called the Neijing Zhi Yao. It showed how even this much later in the history of Chinese medicine, the Huangdi Neijing still mattered, and despite all the annotations and commentaries on the work that had been carried out, there was still more to say. Into our day, this Li Zhongzi version of the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon became the most referenced edition of this work. And this idea of taking the best from each of these factions and using whatever worked was a major step in the right direction of modern Chinese medicine. And with the speed of travel being what it was now in the 1500s, and especially the 1600s, more modern ideas and proven medical techniques were introduced to China, and this helped to push medicine in a new direction. The Ru'is, or Confucian doctors, by the Ming, dominated the medical profession at the top end. They competed with the Lingyi, or itinerant doctors. A ling is a kind of bell, and a yi, of course, means doctor in this case. So these were the doctors who peddled their services like any other tradesperson, a barber, a knife sharpener, and they had their tools of the trade and rang this bell and announced themselves as a traveling physician. So they were given this term bell doctors, or again, ling yi. But for those Ming-era residents of China who were the equivalent of those today who could afford premium health insurance, the Ru'is were the way to go. Ru, of course, being the Chinese character representing all things Confucian. In the early 1600s, the first imperial med schools under the umbrella of the Taiyi Yuan, the Imperial Health Ministry or Bureau, started to appear, first in Beijing and then in other major cities. Having that background in the medical profession was a major driving factor in whether or not one chose this career path. And just as aspiring officials had to know their 5 classics and 4 books backwards and forwards, those studying to take the exams had to know the Su Wen of the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, the Nanjing Classical Difficult Issues, the Shanghan Lun Treatise on Cold-Damaged Diseases, and all the classics of pulsology, the contents of the latest Materia Medica, and all the dosages of the medicines being prescribed. When you walked in to take the exams, given 4 times per year at the local level, you had to know all this material. And for the imperial exam, which was held less frequently, the demands were naturally much higher. The areas of study they were likely to encounter on these medical exams would include acupuncture, pharmacology, internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, obstetrics, and infectious diseases, and others as well. 13 specialties in all. One more interesting person of note was the 5th son of the founding Ming Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang. This was Zhu Su. He too wrote medical books, and his most famous work was called the Jiu Huang Ben Cao, or the Famine Disaster Relief Materia Medica. As the name indicates, it was written in response to the urgent need of providing medical advice in the case of famines or other natural disasters. He listed 414 species of plants, 276 of which were newly added to the list of 138 species written about in previous Materia Medicas, and most of the new species listed of edible plants were located near the city of Kaifeng and other parts of Henan, where he was based. Some of these plants were poisonous, and the book explained how to treat such substances before they could be consumed. And again, it was all written as an emergency manual to follow in the event of a famine. Let's wind things up and look at 3 of the most noteworthy books to come out of the Qing dynasty. One we already mentioned. This was the Qianlong Emperor's Siku Quanshu, the complete library of 4 treasures. This wasn't a medical book, but as I mentioned, it did contain many texts, including Li Shizhen's Ben Cao Gang Mu and Sun Si Miao's Qianjin Yao Fang, the prescriptions of the 1,000 ounces of gold. But probably the most renowned medical text to come out of the Qing was the imperially commissioned Golden Mare of the Orthodox Lineage of Medicine, the Yuzuan Yizong Jin Jian. This was published in 1742 and was another example of the Qianlong Emperor's passion for patronizing large-scale projects and campaigns. Early in his long reign, Qianlong sent an edict to produce this medical text, and the resulting text, known more simply as the Golden Mare, or Jin Jian, sought to point to the medical orthodoxy from centuries past all the way to antiquity as a guide to physicians in the Qing in their practice of medicine. And by hearkening back to the old medical texts, it was striving to show that, old as they may have been, they still held significant scholarship. And the Golden Mare was another addition to the great Chinese tradition of Congshu, or series or collections of books. The Shanghan Lun, in its entirety, was included as part of the Golden Mare, and together with all the commentaries, took up almost a quarter of the whole book. It was called the most important and consequential of the ancient medical classics, and it named those cold damage disorders and their feverish symptoms as the most dangerous of pathogens. The Golden Mare was the result of a 3-year project that began in late 1739 and is the only medical treatise that the Imperial Printing Office printed in the Qing dynasty. 80 people were assigned to the project that would ultimately become the Golden Mare, but only half of them came from the Academy of Medicine. Sections included pediatrics, orthopedics, acupuncture, smallpox, other pox diseases, variolation methods, and ophthalmology. There are illustrations of smallpox in children, as well as depictions of various cancers, and it stands out for its illustrations of various phases of many kinds of diseases. And one other interesting thing about the Golden Mare, it was chock full of these mnemonic rhymes that allowed the passages to be more easily remembered by students and practitioners. I'm not sure how many of you recall from part 3 of that History of Yunnan series, but the one person who the Qianlong Emperor entrusted with directing this Golden Mirror project and other major scholarly works he commissioned was the old Viceroy of Yungui, Ortai. In 1732, following 5 years down in China's southwest, cracking the whip and pacifying the Hui Muslims and other ethnic minority people, Ortai began service as Qianlong's Grand Secretary and took charge of the compilation of the Golden Mirror. The Chinese imperial court was particularly concerned about smallpox, the reason being that the Manchus were more susceptible to this disease than their Chinese subjects. Kangxi had survived smallpox as a young man. With the well-being of his fellow Manchus in mind, Qianlong lit a fire under the pot of smallpox research in China. Variolation as a way to vaccinate people had been used in China since the 1500s. As far as smallpox and the variola virus was concerned, after so many decades of observation, the Chinese figured out once you got smallpox, you couldn't get it again. And this is the underlying concept behind variolation. The process of variolation involved exposing individuals to a mild form of the variola smallpox virus in order to induce a controlled infection. Exposure to a mild form of the virus would trigger a less severe case of smallpox. Edward Jenner came around in the 19th century and figured the whole thing out as far as smallpox vaccination went. But until that time, the far from perfect and sometimes downright deadly variolation procedure was how the Chinese tried to prevent the spread of smallpox. This variolation method was also used in the Middle East. So this Golden Mirror, or the imperially commissioned Golden Mirror of the orthodox lineage of medicine, along with the Siku Quanshu, made up 2 of the big 3 scholarly projects Qianlong commissioned, and this was in the field of medicine. The third great medical text of the Qing was the Gujin Tushu Jicheng, or Synthesis of Books and Illustrations, Past and Present. Between these 3 texts, and let me say again, the Siku Quanshu, complete compilation of the 4 treasures, only contained 97 volumes and 100 additional titles that fell under the medical category. But between these 3, the entirety of everything written, known, and theorized about Chinese medicine, going back to the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, Shen Nong's Materia Medica, and Bian Que's Classic of Difficult Problems, was contained in these 3 books, with the Golden Mirror being the only one of the 3 devoted solely to medicine. By this time in the Qing, as reflected in the major books of this time, a stronger than ever focus was paid to evidentialism. It was no longer accepted as a matter of course that whatever the ancient medical canons contained was the absolute truth. A prescribed drug or treatment was no longer accepted as canon unless it could be proven that it worked. Let me also mention one other thing that was happening in the background since the Ming Dynasty. This was the transition of medical scholarship and the prominence from the traditional northern part of China down to the Jiangnan region, to the southern provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Jiangxi, and Anhui. The physicians who made up this group by no means rejected the classics from antiquity. They just pointed to the ones that were still relevant, and the most cutting-edge treatments in medicine shifted down to the southern part of China amongst these Jiangnan-based physicians. The Golden Mirror is still around today and can be referenced online and in libraries of institutions in Asia where Chinese medicine is taught. The same goes with the Bancao Gangmu, which got a facelift in 1765 by Zhao Xuemin, who published this supplement to Li Shizhen's Bancao Gangmu. And this included many new discoveries of substances that were effective treatments for many common 18th century maladies. Throughout this series, I've only focused on the most celebrated names and their great works, but there were so many other lesser-known texts and noteworthy physicians who made contributions to Chinese medicine. In the Qing, there was Lan Mao. He was a Yunnan herbalist who wrote the Diannan Bancao. As the title suggests, Diannan means southern Yunnan, You recall from the History of Yunnan series, Dian is the single character abbreviation of Yunnan province. And that goes back to the Dian Kingdom that ran concurrent with the Warring States and Western Han periods. This Materia Medica of South Yunnan described all the various medicinal plants and herbal remedies of southern Yunnan that had been used in a variety of ways by all the tribespeople on both sides of the Yunnan borders with Vietnam, Laos, and Burma. As more Western influences seeped into China during and right after the arrival of the Jesuits, the medical science and know-how they brought with them began to have some impact on a lot of the long-established Orthodox Chinese medical knowledge. For the first time ever, in the 16th and especially in the 17th century, medical scholars began to question many of the concepts that had been long accepted as orthodoxy. And as soon as the political foundation of the Qing dynasty began to weaken and self-destruct in slow motion, outside forces rushed in and unleashed a whole bunch of events, some good for the masses of people and some bad. And the more the treaty port system expanded, the more hospitals got built, and from this sudden influx of foreign doctors and nurses in the 1840s and 50s, clear through to the 20th century, the impact this had on the accepted fundamental truths going back to the ancients was profound, to say the least. And you could say the Western versus Chinese medicine debate began right about here. With the arrival of the Europeans and later the Japanese, Western medical techniques and drugs rushed in, along with the missionaries who ran the institutions, taught at the schools, and trained most of China's first generation of nurses and physicians to practice Western medicine. I did an episode on Ida Khan and Mary Stone, CHP 309, I believe that was. They were among the first Chinese to practice, teach, and advocate Western medicine in China, especially in Jiangxi and Shanghai. What we today call TCM, or traditional Chinese medicine, isn't the same one from 100 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago. The same could be said of acupuncture in 2024 versus the acupuncture of the Ming Dynasty. Much of modern acupuncture was developed only in the last century. In any case, this little 5-part series wasn't meant to be a survey of the practice of TCM. I hope by going down the China historical timeline and looking at all these physicians and the great books they wrote or compiled, that you all got something out of it. I had to make a quick decision about how much detail I should use to discuss all the aspects of these functional entities like qi, the xue acupoints, the 5 zang organs, the 6 fu organs, and the meridians that, unseen, branched out to all the organ systems, and how each zang organ is paired with a fu organ, and all the interrelationships, internal and external to the body and nature. Honestly, this could have been twice as long as that 15-part History of Taiwan series. I didn't say anything regarding the treatment of cupping. Someone emailed me the other day and asked me why I hadn't mentioned that yet. So before we close things out, let's look at this oft-described strange kind of traditional Chinese treatment for fevers, pain, poor appetite, indigestion, high blood pressure, skin disorders, anemia, stroke rehabilitation, nasal congestion, the common cold, pneumonia, bronchitis, and infertility. Critics call this a pseudoscience and quack medicine. That doesn't stop people from around the world to seek this treatment. Cupping practitioners claim this treatment, when used, has a therapeutic effect and removes unspecified toxins, stagnant blood, or excess qi. In Chinese, cupping is known as pulling up jars, ba huo guan. When some people see the photos of the skin discolorations and bruises from the hemorrhaged capillaries cupping leaves behind, they're often quite taken aback. Anyway, its history went back to the Han and was used in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Like all TCM treatments, there was no one single way to administer it. Just like with other treatments, the object of cupping is to rearrange qi in the body. I've never tried it myself. During the cupping process, a therapist will put a flammable substance such as alcohol, herbs, or paper in a cup and set it on fire. And as the fire goes out, they put the cup upside down on your skin. And as the air inside the cup cools, a vacuum is created that causes your skin to rise and redden as the blood vessels underneath expand. The cup is generally left in place for up to 3 minutes and leaves behind a rather ghastly-looking red mark. Now, whether or not it is rearranging the chi in your body, who's to say? Anyway, we're running long again, and I wanted to finish this one off and move on to something bigger and better. And looking back on these 5 episodes and preparing the table of Chinese terms like I do with each episode, I realized this isn't an easy topic to present. Even my listeners who speak Chinese have told me this series had a lot of terms to remember. Well, I can see why, but I hope you've all come to appreciate the history and how it developed over the dynasties. Okay, that's going to be it. New topic for next time. I'll go dig through my long list of CHP topics and decide on one that I'm sure you'll like. Thanks as always. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the City of Night, cordially inviting you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.